Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another School of Landscape Architecture lecture series lecture. Today we are hosting Men Collaborative. Men Collaborative is a design and planning firm founded in 2022 with the goal of pursuing interdisciplinary collaboration across equity-focused urban planning, landscape architecture, and landscape urban ecology practices. The firm grounded in restorative strategies for community empowerment. They believe in building the connections between people and the environment and value the empowerment of communities to participate in decision-making about investment that impact them. Their team creates actionable plans and designs that measurably improve a community's quality of life and access to resources while improving the quality of environment. So we have 4 team members here today. 2 of them came from Texas, the other 2 came from Minneapolis, and I will be briefly introducing each of them, starting with Michelle Bright. Michelle grew up in the mountains of Virginia, 15 minutes away from the Blue Ridge Parkway, and at an early age was intrigued and inspired by the natural world. This thread of interest continued as she pursued a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies with a minor in biology at Virginia Commonwealth University, graduating in 2005. Michelle was an environmental lab technician, then shifted over to environmental consulting focused on freshwater wetlands and aquatic systems. At AKRF Inc., a consulting firm in Philadelphia, she got introduced to landscape architecture and planning practices. Seeing opportunities of melding her environmental, ecological background with design and planning, she attended the University of Texas at Austin from 2010 to 2013 and received a Master in Landscape Architecture. Now next, Zach Lockrem. Born and raised in working-class South Minneapolis, Zach hails from a family with a rich heritage in the building trades. Growing up amidst construction sites, he developed a keen interest in the rules and regulations that shape our communities. Despite embarking on a diverse career journey that involved teaching English as a foreign language, promoting concerts, and managing a bookstore, Zach was fortunate to rediscover his early passion. To his delight, he discovered that urban planning was a field of study, and he found a university in his current city that catered to older, non-traditional students like himself. You're not old. At the age of 27, Zach earned a Bachelor of Science in Urban Affairs from Boston University's Metropolitan College. He furthered his education at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, obtaining a Master's in Urban Planning in 2010. Next, Sandy Molners-Comstock. I hope I said it right. As a licensed landscape architect, Sandy is passionate about applying her experience and skill toward projects that have positive and lasting impact on communities and the environment. She works at all scales of design, and her work has spanned from large-scale to site-scale planning and implementation. With part of her background coming from design build, Sandy has a keen eye for details and how things come together, believing in applying sustainability-based practices to the built environment throughout all phases of construction. Sandy also believes in building teams that will support the best project outcomes, and ensuring robust community involvement drives her public space work. She holds a Bachelor of Environmental Design, a Master of Landscape Design degree from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and is a registered landscape architect in the state of Minnesota. Carrie Spiegelhalter. Carrie is a registered landscape architect who works on a broad range of parks, ecology, and equity-related planning and design projects that enhance urban ecosystems, public health, and environmental justice. She is especially interested in how participatory design processes build ecological and social resilience in communities. Bringing a background in both science and design, Carrie's work focuses on quantifying the benefits that access to high-quality natural spaces have on community members and physical and mental health. Carrie received her Master's of Landscape Architecture from Cornell and holds a dual BA in Biology and Environmental Studies from Lawrence University. So please join me in welcoming to FIU.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to kick us off here. And first thing we want to say is a big thank you to FIU to inviting us here today. We were really excited to share everything that we've been working on, and I'm happy to take questions from you at the end of this presentation. So as the introduction says, we're MEND Collaborative, and the four of us here are the four founding partners of our company. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about how we use mending and mending places, a collaborative approach to repairing and restoring our communities, and how we kind of use this metaphor of mending. And what you'll see on the screen here is what's called a darning sample. And what this is kind of a historic piece of fabric and sewing that shows all the different ways that someone who's repairing a garment might make different stitches or different ways to approach something that has been torn. And we're going to be using the idea of mending and sewing and repairing and restoring as a metaphor for a lot of the work that we do, and we'll explain how that works and our philosophy and how that gets presented in our design work and planning work throughout this presentation. So as she mentioned, we come from Texas and Minneapolis. Michelle and I flew in a couple days ago from Austin, and Zach and Sandy are from Minneapolis. And while those two places might seem really different on initial glance, they actually have a lot in common. They're both border cities. We have Minnesota up with the border of Canada, and Texas is, or border states, and Texas is on the border of Mexico. They're also, in the heartland of our country. They're also the start and kind of end points of the Great Central Flyway, where we see birds and butterflies and bats migrating up and down the country into Mexico, into Canada, throughout the course of the year. And then finally, there are actually a lot of ecological similarities between these two places. Prairies really tie these two locations together. In Texas, we have the Blackland Prairie ecosystem, and to the north in Minneapolis and Minnesota, we have tallgrass prairie ecosystems that kind of arose out of glaciation and kind of the flattening of those landscapes. So we really are able to kind of work collaboratively across our two geographies and kind of compare and contrast our projects that we're working on and the diversity of perspectives that we're seeing from our clients and the communities that we serve in a really interesting way. So that's a little bit about where we're from, and our approach and who we are is that we're a multidisciplinary firm in front of you right now. We have planners, landscape architects, urban ecologists, and we all really work together to bridge our different types of expertise, to work with communities, to create places that are kind of equitable and really serve the community. And I'm going to hand it off to Zach to talk a little bit more.
So when we founded our firm in 2022, we really thought about the use of intersectionality as a framework for practice within landscape and design. And we mean intersectionality both in terms of the different disciplinary perspectives that we bring, being people trained as landscape architects, people trained as planners, but also really understanding the ways that our lived experience shape the way that we work and practice within the work. Our planning and design fields have historically been underrepresented, and there are a lot of groups that have not been able to come into these fields in as full a way. So we think a lot about our BIPOC partners, about the way that women or people from the LGBTQ community, working class community members, and immigrant community members have historically been excluded from these fields, and even beyond that, in the areas where they do come in, often they are sort of taught to suppress their difference as a way of becoming professionals. And our practice was really, we wanted to be built on the idea that we could bring our lived experience along with our disciplinary experience in order to actually create better design by being able to share those things with communities that we were working with as well. I often tell the story, one of the things that I love the most about this group is when we actually go on a site visit. And you can see so clearly the way that each of our different types of experience lead us to actually experience these spaces differently. So as we are actually introducing and coming onto a site for the first time, I, as the planner, I'm looking at the edges. I'm looking at how are people moving through the spaces? What are the conditions for the built fabric around a natural space? Michelle, with her background in ecology, is usually jumping into some plant somewhere and finding things she wants us to taste. Each of us are just bringing a very different sort of perspective to it. So we wanted to start by telling you a little bit more about who each of us are. My name is Zach Lockram. I was trained as an urban planner. I come from a low-income, working-class background. I'm a first-generation college student. And I bring a focus within my urban planning of also being very interested in things like history and literature and music, and thinking about the ways that those are key items that can help shape cultural experience of space, and thinking about the ways that those can be brought into planning and design.
Thank you, Zach. I'm Sandy Melners-Comstock. I'm a PLA landscape architect up in Minneapolis. You'll see under my photo there, in situ based design. So what I'm really passionate about is really studying the culture, the food, the history of a space and a place that we're looking at. What is this community about? What really makes this place special? So when we talk about in situ based design, I really like to think holistically about how can impacts that we're having in this community really emphasize what's happening culturally there, what's really going to serve those people, what ecologically is going to make the most sense in this place. So yeah, that's me.
My name is Carrie Spiegelhalter, and I am also trained as a landscape architect for my master's degree, but my undergrad was actually in biology, and so I really bring a passion for kind of science-based, evidence-based design work into what I do, and I think a lot about community health and how we can look at the latest research on how the built environment can support or degrade community health outcomes, and also thinking about how we can quantify a lot of our community outreach and kind of match that with qualitative data to kind of come up with best outcomes and recommendations for communities.
And I'm Michelle Bright, and yes, I would be the one probably digging around in the plants, digging around in the soil. But some of my background, too, comes from before I got into private practice, I worked at a nonprofit for multiple years, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and I learned there from some amazing colleagues about ecological design, and also how to create programming where people get connected to the environment. So we did a lot of citizen science work, and that's stuff we bring forward to our practice, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about that today. I might stand up so I can read my slides a little bit better. But before we move on, I wanted to introduce you to our full team. If you want to go to the next slide. Some of the folks that we work with, this is our staff. We have Kennedy Raw, she's in the Austin, Texas office. We also have Olivia Halsney and Todd Austin, and they're in our Minneapolis office. And this is our full team, and we want to mention this group and who works with us because they are keeping the ship afloat while we're here with you today. They do such amazing work, and we're so honored to have them as part of our team. A lot of our process and projects, too, involve an amazing group of sub-consultants as well. And so we'll be mentioning those throughout our projects, too, today. So what does it mean to mend? Us coming together, one of the first things we reflected back on is how do we mend internally? Working already in private practices or other firms, we noticed that there's kind of a system of sometimes abuse in some of the work in planning and design firms. And so we wanted to make, first and foremost, it be very clear to ourselves, and then also with our staff, how can we think of our internal processes so that we're not overburdening somebody. So somebody's not working 60 hours a week and being stretched super, super thin. So part of the way we do that is through meeting every single week, getting on the same page of what we need to do and how we can help each other to meet our goals for our projects. So that was the first thing, is just reflecting back on the practice, making sure we can mend our relationships to the studio practice overall. So that was our first thing. But then it also means to think about restoring and repairing. So that's something that comes up when we're thinking about landscape, but also groups and communities and neighborhoods. It also means to work with elements that are already present. We're not trying to wipe things clean. We're trying to use what we're learning from nature and from communities to mend it all together and make a better whole. We also believe in reestablishing relationships. So if there's a disconnect between goals of the city and a community, that's the place we want to be. There's also sometimes projects where there's disconnects between what the future of the land and the conservation goals are for a property and what the city wants. And then lastly, it means that it's an iterative and ongoing process, and it's never fully done. We're always mending. Our communities are always shifting and changing. Our environments are always shifting and changing. So that's a little bit about what it means to mend to us. Yeah. Oh no. There we go. All right. Okay, so why do we mend? I want to just draw your attention to this beautiful graphic really quick. And this is a technique used to take something that has a hole and actually create something beautiful out of it. So this is a stitching pattern that reinforces and makes sure the hole doesn't get larger, but it makes it beautiful and it doesn't disappear that damage that's already there. So we mend because our communities and our ecologies have experienced harm, and we recognize that. Our projects are also contextual. There's not a one-size-fits-all. So we usually don't repeat our processes for our clients. It's a custom process, and they may have similar phases, but it's always done slightly different. Mending means we're not hiding the past. We sometimes have to take a step back and reflect on the histories of harm that have occurred. And you'll see some examples of that in our projects today. And then lastly, it's a very inclusive process with humans, with if there's ecologies involved, non-human features, and then also the environment. And then how do we mend? So again, another Japanese process here called Tintsugu, and it's a process of melding a cracked bowl with a metal. And in the end, it's something more beautiful. And so we mend through deep collaboration, and that's in our name, Mend Collaborative, through restoration, and then through repair. And right now, what we're gonna do is take you through some of our projects as examples of all these three different words that we use through our process. So I'll pass it to Zach.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about collaboration and what that means to us. And we're going to talk about collaboration with communities. Almost all of the work that we do is deeply tied to community engagement and really working deeply with the communities that the projects that we are putting forward are actually going to impact, making sure that there's a key feedback between us as professionals and the community as those who are going to be living and working in those spaces. We're going to talk a little bit about the way that we think about collaboration between disciplines, and then how we bring in both qualitative and quantitative thinking as a way of pushing forward that design. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about a plan called the Downtown Denton Plan. This is a project that we're doing in a city called Denton, Texas. This is a little bit north of Dallas, and it is a wonderful, wonderful college town. Two very large universities with a historic downtown situated in between them. And we've had the real pleasure of working with the city on a downtown plan, and as a part of that, also working on a large park master plan, which we'll talk a little bit more later through the process. One of the things that we do like to do is think about collaboration outside of just the design fields traditionally. So something that we do a lot of is actually working with artists. So as we entered into this project and started thinking about the ways that we wanted to engage with community, we were actually able to work with a local artist in Denton to help us create a brand for the project that brought together some of the key things that people love about Denton and helped us express a little bit more about what the feel of Denton was that we would be actually incorporating into the work that we were doing. All of our work, as I said, is very community-based, and I want to talk a little bit about our key values in thinking about the ways that we engage with communities. Our experience has been when you're doing urban planning, when you're doing landscape architecture, there's a typical process that happens in a lot of cases where you have a couple of workshops. The same maybe 20 or 30 people who are always engaged in everything will show up for you. But you're often missing a wide variety of the diversity of community members that are actually involved in processes. So we always start with setting goals. We want to understand the demographics of the community. We want to think about the ways that we're making sure that we're tailoring opportunities to engage to different communities. We often try to go to people rather than holding our own meetings. So throughout this process, we've held a number of different pop-ups and different types of meetings where we're going to events that tailor to different demographics and really at those events engaging people around some of the key issues within downtown. This has meant that we've gotten a really wide variety of different types of feedback, all the way from the people who would be engaged anyways, they still find a way to find us, but we get to have conversations with those that we don't often have conversations with. In some of these examples, we've even had opportunities where we've been doing pop-ups in downtowns and we've been able to have long conversations with unhoused people that actually live in and around the central square who have a really unique perspective on understanding the goings-on as well as being able to talk about some of the specific needs of their communities. As a part of the process, I'm sorry if you can go back a slide, we do always hybrid. We always do both online and in-person components of engagement, and that's something that we've really found lets us reach different audiences in different ways who want to engage on different levels. Tons of pop-ups, again, tailoring to different demographics. We've gotten to do pop-ups at the Denton Black Film Festival. They have a lot of musical events as a part of their downtown, and we do still have some of the normal workshops. Now, when we're engaging people, we don't like to sort of bring a lot of the types of decisions that we as designers should be making. You know, there can be a tendency, if you show a community member a bunch of pictures of different architectural solutions, they're going to be engaged with something they think is aesthetically pleasing, but they might not really understand the goals behind it. You might not actually understand why they are choosing those sorts of things. So we work a lot around talking to people about their goals and objectives and what we call intentions within what they're doing. And ultimately, through a public engagement process, that produces something like this that actually gets into what are the key goals and opportunities that you all want to see as a part of that design process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about design outcomes in that one. We'll come back to it later.
Thank you, Zach. So I'm going to switch and sort of at the other end of the funnel. So the Denton project is a large-scale planning effort. Falwell Park is an implementation project. So this is actually going to be built this summer. So Falwell Park is a beautiful, lovely, large park in North Minneapolis. And North Minneapolis is a historically disinvested, majority African-American neighborhood in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Park and Rec Board is our client for this project, and they operate separately from the city, so they're their own entity. They set up their own processes, they sort of kick off and engage their own projects. So it's kind of a unique way for a park and recreation board to be set up within a municipality. For this project, this was the sort of first community-based implementation project phase to come out of the service area master plan that was done for the North Service area. So this is a really exciting one for us to be involved in because it's the first all-wheel park, which is essentially a skate park, but it's a lot more inclusive. We make considerations for larger diameter wheeled elements such as bicycles, wheelchairs, hence the name All-Wheel Park. And this is the first all-wheel park in North Minneapolis. So it's going to be, once it's built, a really dynamic and great feature for the community there in a community that has seen a lot of disinvestment in its park spaces over a century. This process was particularly challenging because the service area master plan was done and completed in 2019, and the park board used budgeting and funding for this project based on numbers from back then, but through the pandemic, through the past couple of years, a lot of stuff has ballooned, a lot of changes to requirements when it comes to how stormwater is treated, and all of that has changed as well. So we were dealing with a really tight budget on this project, and the community engagement that we did for this project, we really asked the community, you know, here's what the master plan calls for. We can't afford all of it. So all of our community engagement efforts for this project was very much so focused on having the community prioritize the improvements that they wanted to see here. The all-wheel park was thankfully a very large priority for the community. They were very excited to see this. We had a technical advisory community that really helped us communicate what this could look like, what this means for the community. They were great advocates for this portion of the project. And then the community really wanted to prioritize some communal gathering spaces within the park. This is a really large park with a lot of tree coverage, which isn't necessarily the case throughout the rest of North Minneapolis. So the community really spends a lot of time here, but there wasn't a lot of really great gathering spaces in the center of the park. So we were able to, as part of this project, prioritize gathering space over anything else and fit that within the budget as well. If you can keep seeing that slide, sorry. So one other thing on this project that we really want to emphasize is not just when we talk about intersectionality when it comes to our backgrounds and who we are as working professionals, but in our project approaches, we really try to intentionally build our projects to achieve the best outcomes for our community. And we really want to empower businesses that have similar sort of guiding principles and, are kind of in a similar scale and size and position as us. So when we're building project teams, we try and intentionally really incorporate disadvantaged businesses, women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses when we're building project teams. So if you don't mind flipping, thank you. So for this project in particular, we were the lead consultant. And for an implementation project, we knew we needed to have various types of engineers. We had to have cost estimating for this project. We had to have a skate park builder. So when we were looking at this, rather than going to a big engineering firm that could do it all under one umbrella, we really wanted to build an intentional team that reflected the values of both our team and the community. So our civil engineer is Alon Design Labs. They're a certified targeted small business. They're certified throughout the state as a disadvantaged business owned by women. The electrical engineer is Victus Engineering. They're a certified small and minority business. They're both WBE, which is Women Business Enterprise, which we're also certified as, and minority business. Our cost estimator is also a certified small business enterprise that is minority and women owned. And then shout out to FIU. One of your alumni works at Hunger Skate Parks, who we're working with on this project. He is a landscape architect designer working at Hunger Skate Parks. And though they're not a certified women-owned business in any jurisdiction, they are half led and half owned by a woman. So it's a really dynamic project team that is going to lead to really great outcomes for this community.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to continue with this theme of collaboration. Sandy and Zach just spoke a little bit about how they're doing it with Denton and Minneapolis, but we recently worked on a project with the city of El Paso, and we got to flex and think about collaboration through many different user groups. So their challenge for us was to help them plan and start the planning process for an all abilities playground. Not only what should be in the playground, but also where it might be in El Paso. And they already have kind of a series of parks that have all abilities features throughout El Paso, both in the county and with the city. And then recently, they just approved bond money, I guess it was in 2022, for another all abilities park. And I have all abilities highlighted there because that was really the main challenge and opportunity for our team. How do you reach out and collaborate with as many people as possible and with many disabilities and abilities to create the best space? Great. So immediately, we knew we had to reach out in many different ways. So like Zach already mentioned, we did hybrid ways of reaching out. We got in contact with or touched about 1,000 different people. We had 12 different engagement events. We had multiple surveys, and the city of El Paso has a great kind of online survey platform where you can do it in multiple languages, and you can actually view the results as they're coming in. So we were able to use that platform, which was awesome. But through all of this, we still had to have engagement events that include people of many different abilities and children. And we knew that thinking about how we use both quantitative and qualitative data for engagement was important for us to think about. A survey is quite easy. You can see that data pretty fast. But when you're working with children, you want to do that in a more subtle way. So you can go to the next one. This was also something we asked the community, is what is your vision for this playground? Why is it important to do this for the city of El Paso? And this is what they chose. The All Abilities Playground in El Paso is a place where everyone in our community can come together and play regardless of their abilities and without barriers. So one of the first things we started planning was how do we connect with children? And most engagement with adults, you have these things called workshops. We decided to call these play shops. And one of the things that was decided early on is we would have a series of stations where children can come together and experience different, and have different kind of design and questions towards them about play. And some of that included free play. But we didn't want to be always asking them, why did you do this? And what are you doing? And how? And it's just kind of awkward. So we used an observational way of doing this. We would watch what they were playing with, take a photograph, and then at the end of the day, we were able to collaborate on what we were seeing overall. So these are some of the images from that event. On the left, what we were noticing in the free play build area, people were building towers, they were building castles, they were building forts. That was a very common thing we were seeing. We also had a theming exercise asking what would a really inspiring theme for this playground be? And we used these series of stackable blocks and stickers, so they were able to pick themes and add stickers. Dinosaurs was the very favorite of everyone, but in the end, I think we merged this with our survey results as well, and it was really thought of is that we need multiple themes. It shouldn't just be one theme, so dinosaurs may have kind of a feature in it. We also had sensory play. Sensory play in all abilities playgrounds is really important because if you're visually impaired, you still may have the opportunity to hear things or feel things. So that was a big part of our event. We also had drawing activities and also sticker activities where we were observing different things. And you can go to the next one. This here is just one piece of the survey that was geared more toward adults or caretakers. And we also noticed the things we observed from the children's play shop were reflected in the survey. So here, actually, the play tower for social play came in really high for even adults and caretakers. And then lastly, we did think quite a bit of caretakers. When you go to a playground with a child or somebody that you're taking care of, the caretaker needs comfort and support as well, or you're not gonna go. You know, if it's hard for you to go and to get there and get your family there and to stay safe. So we created an individual caretaker survey that was also distributed through 30 different organizations through El Paso to get an idea of what people needed. And then the final thing I'll say is we had a great focus group of people experiencing different disabilities across the board, and it often just took one-on-one engagements where Sandy and I were just walking with somebody that was visually impaired and walking around a playground site. So in this process, it was collaboration on many different levels and taking in both the quantitative and qualitative data to get us to our recommendations for this project.
So the second theme we wanted to talk about is this theme of restoring or restoration. You know, really thinking about this act of returning something to a former owner, a former place, a former condition. One of our very first projects as we started as a new firm was the opportunity to work with an organization called Reconnect Rondo. Reconnect Rondo is a community-based African-American organization in St. Paul, Minnesota that came together around a community that had been displaced by highway construction. In the graphic here, I don't know how many of you know this wonderful Instagram site, but they've done an incredible job of documenting all of the ways in which African-American communities were targeted by highway construction in the United States during the 60s and 70s. You can actually see in the map, the Rondo neighborhood is Area G. It was the highest concentration of African-Americans in Minnesota at the time. So only 7,000 people, but this community really was still seen as a threat to the white community at large and was targeted with the construction of I-94, which you see there. Something that was really unique in this particular community is that despite the displacement that happened, that over 700 homes, 300 businesses were destroyed as a process of creation of this highway. Community members started gathering again in these spaces right after the highway came through. So they started actually a set of reunions that became a festival that would go on year after year. And over the 50 years in between the time that this happened and today, there's actually been a growth of the political power of that community. So as I-94 reaches its 50th anniversary and is up for reconstruction, this idea came forward of really asking the entities that had created the highway in the first place, the US DOT and MnDOT, it was really seen that there was an opportunity to give back to the community in terms of actually creating a land bridge. So actually capping over the highway, restoring land to the community in a way that was community driven and community led. But one of the important things within this idea is we really understand that displacement doesn't just happen because the government comes and takes your house. It can also happen because costs rise and you no longer have the ability to live there. It can also happen because a culture is displaced and people don't feel comfortable in belonging in those areas. So tied to this idea of this land bridge was this idea that we actually needed to have not just the land bridge, but that Rondo actually needed to be what has been called a cultural enterprise district, that we actually needed to create a framework to ensure that community members in that community had the ability to remain in the community, that people who had been displaced had an ability to return to the community, and that the investments that were happening in the community were actually being reinvested into the community. So we're really imagining now a whole new economic cycle where value is being created by the addition of this new land, but that is being invested back into economic prosperity in the community and really seeing a cycle of generational wealth building happening within the neighborhood. This is done in a deep amount of community engagement and again, really working with communities to understand the ways that we can put programs into place as a part of moving this forward. Two of the most important components that have come out of this, the first is something called the Inheritance Fund, which, as far as I'm aware, is the first time that this has happened in the United States. the City of St. Paul will give up to $100,000 in down payment assistance to people who are displaced or their descendants who want to move back to the community. So they've actually put money behind allowing people to actually return to the community. The other component that's been really interesting is the establishment of what's called a community investment trust. This is being built using philanthropic funding, but what it means is that for this new land that is built, the community members in the neighborhood will actually have shares in that and will actually act as the developer within the neighborhood, so that there's actually the potential for financial return to come back to community members for new development that's happening in that neighborhood. As a part of this, part of what we evaluated is, well, what actually can be built on this new land? And having a direct conversation with the community around what type of construction, not destruction, last time was destruction, this time it's construction, do you actually want to see in the community? And really thinking through the potential benefits and opportunities as a part of that. And I think, as you can imagine, a lot of the time when we do community engagement, there's a lot of people who are very concerned about new development in their communities because they don't actually see the benefit to it. In this case, because the community members were actually standing to be part owners within this development, it's a very different conversation, because you start to have conversation that's both about what are the community benefits in terms of community uses and parks and open space, but also really starting to think about what are the potential financial returns from having denser development and creating more homes in the area. So very, very interesting way of beginning to engage with community around community actually having an opportunity to shape their environment and see benefit come back to them.
Great, thank you. All right, so Zach took you on a journey in St. Paul. Now we're gonna go back to Texas and talk a little bit about restoration and more land-based restoration. So one of our projects, it's called Singleton Preserve Conservation and Ecological Stewardship Plan. We just finished this up, so it's kind of fresh off the presses. But I wanted to use it as an example to talk about what do we restore, how do we restore, creating a community of care for a space, and then lastly, a little bit about kind of ecological design and landscape processes. So the little dot that you're seeing on the kind of bottom of this aerial is the city of Cedar Hill. It's part of the larger metroplex of Fort Worth and Dallas, which you can tell it's been built out pretty intensely, and really the little green patches that are along that reservoir are almost these last really important spots in this really urban area. And one of the reasons it's not developed is it's actually a large kind of hill. It's an old fracture or escarpment is what we call it in Texas. So just a fracture in the earth that creates the topography. And so it has this really interesting landscape of a mixture of West Texas and also East. And that's shown through the different species there. You get birds that are more eastern species. You get plants like flowering dogwood, which is very east, while at the same time getting west. And so the city of, you can go to the next one too. The city of Cedar Hill has decided, because they're situated there, that they want to try to conserve about 25% of their land. So it's a big goal for them. So when we entered this process, we're going, well, you know, what do you do? How do you restore some land like this? You don't take it back to a certain place in time. We know that in our environments and in the world around us, climate change is occurring. There's major changes just with resilience and the migration of species. So we like to think of restoration in restoring the function of landscapes. And the function and health to us is the different kind of processes that are working and functioning well. So we use this pyramid to understand it a little bit more. The first base layer of what creates a really healthy space is the geomorphic processes in the landform. What is that landform? Then you have the mineral soils, your living soils, your organic and chemical nutrients, and then the biology, which is all the plants and animals that live there. And essentially, you can be in a state of disrepair within this pyramid. if you're at level 1, that might be a place that has recently been mined and the landscape is completely cut into. Like, I'm thinking of like mountaintop removal, it's gonna take you a lot of different land management techniques to get you to 5, all the way up. Luckily, at Cedar Hill, we were kind of in the 4 to 5 area, so we were doing pretty well. You can go to the next one. We also had such a variation in topography at this site. We had a creek at the lower level, all the way up to kind of this escarpment, this limestone, shallow soil at the top. So our site represented this mosaic of ecosystems that we knew wouldn't have necessarily been there because it had an old field for pasturing cattle there, but it was important to have these patches of prairie in the area that was dominated by forest. So we made sure to think of landscape mosaics as a way of creating kind of this ecosystem resilience and also richness within this more urban area. The picture with the people and that last one, that was from a BioBlitz. We also know that it's super important to get people interested and excited about land management processes. Without people that care, it's not gonna go anywhere. So we were really excited to host BioBlitzes at the site to understand what's there. And also, we're not always the expert. For especially really nuanced kind of naturalist things, you need people in the community to come help you and tell you. So that small bird right there, that's a Vesper swallow or sparrow, which to me just looks like a brown bird because I don't specialize in that, but that's actually a really special one that they saw at the site when we went out there with ornithologists, and they got very excited about it. So we definitely use that as part of our process. You can go to the next one. We also, when we go to a site, we are not, again, gonna say, let's just wipe this clean. It should all be a prairie, cut down the forest. What we use is this kind of hierarchy of understanding the space. What is the areas that already are in great functional quality? Let's protect and conserve those areas. What areas do you need to manage? And you can see this is kind of a graph. So on the left side here, the ecological function and the level of effort kind of pair up. When you're having to restore or totally recreate. Recreate would be, again, like you have a roadway and you want to put a forest back in. That's going to take a lot of effort and challenge. So when we go to the site, this was something we were looking at too. So we were being conscious of their level of effort as staff to go out there and do these techniques in land management. And then the last few things I'll talk about, if you go to the next one. This is an overview of the site as an aerial and drone shot. You can actually see Dallas in the background. So it just gives you an idea of how close this land was to really dense urban areas. And this kind of displays the mosaic of landscapes that we have on the site. Some of the early wins for them was just knowing, oh wait, we have a floodplain that we've been mowing. We've just been mowing it because it used to house cattle. That's an area we can actually just start pulling back on our mowing and starting to let the land recover, let some of those riparian species come back into play. And you can go to the next one, Carrie. And then the last thing we like to do when we're thinking about restoring function back to our land is if there are ways to mimic natural processes. So just like here in Florida, fire, it was part of the landscape. And in this area, they've suppressed fire, so fire doesn't run through the landscapes anymore because of development. But it's actually important to do things like prescribe fires. It reduces the amount of biomass so you don't have major wildfires. And so this isn't from the site, this is from when I worked at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, where we would do prescribed fires, which are planned fires where you can very carefully burn an area and let it recover over time. So I don't know if Cedar Hill will be able to do prescribed fire in the future, but they have had a lot of challenges where they've had more wildfire risk. So it's something they're gonna start talking about with, I think it's Texas Parks and Wildlife that does it nearby them. So we suggested a partnership between them to maybe do that in the future. So that's a little bit about restoring our lands.
Great, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by mending through repairing. And that's a little different from restoring because you're fixing or mending something that is broken or kind of torn apart in some way, but not with the intention of bringing it back to an original state. It really kind of transforms and becomes something new, where you see the history of what it once was, and you're mending and repairing to tell a story to create something new and unique. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sunset Valley Savannah Trail. This is in Sunset Valley, Texas, which is a small municipality actually nested within Austin. And they have a lot of open space and natural areas and used to be kind of an agricultural town. So this site, this land, is actually an old ranch, and there's a lot of grazing happening. And right kind of down the middle of what you're seeing here, if you take all the design work away, is a creek and a floodplain. And actually the majority of this land is in a floodplain that had been grazed by cattle for decades and decades. So we were tasked with by the city of Sunset Valley to think about how we can kind of get people to this site and to use it as a trail. And it's going to kind of do repairing in several ways, because this is a piece of land that kind of is a kind of broken puzzle piece between two trails from the north and the south. So the creation of a trail at this site will kind of connect their trail system to create a whole more complete loop. So that's kind of our first priority, was to make that connection, to make that repair between two pieces of trail that were disconnected. Our second kind of task and way of thinking about this was to rehabilitate the floodplain and repair some of those ecosystem processes, kind of like Michelle touched on earlier. How do we repair some of these ecosystem functions and hydrological cycles that have been broken through the result of compaction due to overgrazing? What's our landscape strategy for that restoration? And then how do we highlight the unique qualities of this area? It's within a very, very urban context. As you can see from this previous slide, there are actually shopping centers surrounding it. There's a lot of homes that are really close by. So this is it's repairing in that we're bringing it back to a new state. We're not restoring it back to kind of prehistoric conditions and let it be untouched, but we're using kind of landscape interventions to bring people to the site, to repair people's relationship with the land, to repair hydrological functions. So our first approach was to think about how do we repair these natural functions and tell stories through landscape restoration. So we came up with an approach for the different kind of landscape areas across the site, specifically the floodplain that you can kind of see in the blue there. How do we bring function back to that? Mostly through integrating more biodiversity, more native species. Right now, a lot of it is a monoculture of an invasive called bastard cabbage and Bermuda grass and other sorts of species that are not native to Texas, and that we want to integrate a little bit more diversity into that. And then, because this is such a site that we want the community to come to, and we want people to be able to interface with this and travel around the trail, how do we use art to tell the story of kind of the community and the restoration that's happening here? And not only to have the art be aesthetically pleasing and to tell a story, but to actually actively help the restoration and the rehabilitation process as well. So for example, the artful tree enclosures, these would be added around small trees or other plants that would be in the floodplain. Historically, Texas floodplains often have large trees. It's really sometimes the only areas where large trees like pecans can grow, because that's really only areas where water is readily available to those large trees. So if we're planting baby pecans in the floodplain of this creek, we want to protect them from deer and other animals that would be eating them. And so we could put these artful tree enclosures in to help help kind of these trees survive and also be an artistic piece situated in the landscape. And we're actually working with an artist right now to get a lot of these pieces designed and built, so that's been a really exciting process. Another impactful installation that we're working on is artful insect shelter boxes, so bringing pollinators and wildlife back to this site, creating different installations actually within the creek itself through these gabion installations that are going to capture water and hold it in these little nooks and crannies to create little kind of micro ecosystems to help different plant species grow, kind of cross a different gradient of different water levels and hydrological conditions. And then finally, this is the one I'm very excited about. These artful, artificial perches is what we're calling them. So they're kind of these vertical follies in the landscape that are poles that birds will be able to land on and bring seeds from other places across central Texas as they're migrating or visiting this site and deposit the seeds when they land on the perches and use the bathroom. Then we're bringing in seeds and increasing diversity. And eventually these perches will become obsolete as trees kind of come up and take their place. So really thinking about how we can use art to tell the story of what's happening with this process of repair, and then also actively helping to repair itself. And then another project we have in Sunset Valley as well is called Reimagine Brody Lane. And I'm going to kind of show a little bit of the existing conditions of what we're working with here. This is a major commercial corridor for the city, who really has kind of big box type development, strip mall type development along this corridor, Brody Lane. But they're very forward thinking and they're looking to the future, and also in collaboration with other organizations in the Texas kind of Austin area, and one of which is an organization that's building a regional trail called the Violet Crown Trail that goes from, if you can see, there's a highway that crosses at the very top of the kind of upper right-hand corner of that screen. And where you're seeing a purple dashed line, that's a future trail that's going to connect a trailhead just beyond the northern section of that highway down Brody Lane. It's going to take a turn and then connect with another trailhead that you'll see right there and connect to that green path. So this is a really critical connection between those two trailheads. And right now, it is a pretty uncomfortable place to be. When you're walking down Brody Lane, the sidewalks are about 5 feet. They're about right next to the road. Cars are going about 40 miles an hour, and it is not very great. And so the city is saying, okay, we know we're gonna have this trail coming in. We have all this retail. We have all these cool restoration activities that we're doing. We have this commitment to kind of bringing wildlife and nature and open spaces back to our city through projects like Sunset Valley Savannah Trail. So how do we transform this corridor into a place that's comfortable for pedestrians and bicyclists that are going to be using this trail? How do we get them to see everything that we're doing here, maybe spend some time shopping, maybe spend some time at a restaurant, and see some of the other spaces and this landscape restoration that we're doing? Oh, can't see. Can you go to the next one if you have a chance? There we go. Okay. So the first thing that we're doing is looking at all these different types of hiking and biking facilities that could be placed in different typologies along the length of the corridor. So that is, in ideal scenario, what we're looking at is a separated facility. I wish I had a laser pointer. That's kind of at the bottom here where we're oh, we do. Oh, that's great. Separating the bike and the pedestrian areas, kind of setting it back from the road, utilizing a lot of the right-of-way that they have between the road and the shopping centers and the parking there. And then kind of the second tier is doing a combined facility where they're still striped, separated, painted to show bicyclists and pedestrians in specific areas, but compressing that into one kind of non-separated by a division to be able to get people comfortably down the corridor. But this also changes as you kind of travel north to south, because as you leave the high-density commercial area, we're actually going to bring it down to just a 12-foot path that will comfortably accommodate bicyclists and pedestrians in a kind of lower volume area, because people will probably mostly be making a connection to that other path, the Violet Crown Trail I mentioned earlier, or visiting shopping and restaurants in the northernmost section. And then, we're also thinking about how we can enliven this space and tell the story of Sunset Valley through things like art, wayfinding. They really wanted to see more lighting along the corridors, so this could be a place where people could go in the early mornings or later into the evenings, and integrating a lot of green stormwater like bioswales to be able to take a lot of the water that's coming off of this road and infiltrate it and kind of filter out the pollutants, because this city is also actually sitting above a major aquifer for the Austin area. So filtering water is really important to kind of keeping our drinking water clean here. And then finally, kind of repairing how this road had originally been built to be very car-centric. And this shows some of the ways that we are slowing down cars and really deprioritizing them as part of this process. We have a raised intersection, just comes out up about 6 inches, but it really slows people down as they're approaching these major intersections along the corridors. This is kind of an axon showing that the separation of the two paths here, that the trail is really pushed back into the right of way, not along the road anymore, highlighting more lighting so that people can feel more safe as they're crossing and using the spaces, kind of decreasing potential for collisions with cars, and so on like that. And I'll have Sandy talk about Quakertown.
Thanks, Carrie. So when we're talking about repairing should be contextual. It should consider social, historical, and ecological conditions of a site. So what we're looking at here is Quakertown Park, and this is a downtown park that is part of the overall downtown master plan effort that we're doing for Denton, Texas, that Zach talked about earlier. This process for sort of revisioning Quakertown Park grew to become its own sort of parallel process as part of the overall downtown master planning. Quakertown Park has a very complex history, a very layered history. There's a lot of timelines to Quakertown Park that overlap with each other, abut each other. There's a lot of historical context here that we need to be considerate of. There's also a lot of ecological context for us to be considerate of here. 2 creeks converge within this park. They have become channelized within concrete channels. So when we're talking about, what does restoration look like from an ecological perspective? So there's a lot to think about when we're talking about Quakertown Park here. So to orient you a little bit, the sort of core of the historic downtown is just to the southwest off the image here. So it's a pretty urban park if you think about it. It's a pretty built up area. It's just south by a couple blocks, I'd say 2 blocks from the Texas Women's University. It has a very complex history. So when we were approaching this project as sort of this parallel process of the downtown master plan, how do we acknowledge and honor these layered histories? I'll get into that in just a moment. How do we find consensus among the various stakeholder groups that have a stake within each of these histories? And how do we reestablish a positive relationship with the social and the natural systems within this urban context? Oh, yeah. So I'll introduce this image a little bit, and that this is sort of going to introduce the first social timeline of Quakertown Park. So Quakertown Park got its name from, it was sort of a neighborhood called Quakertown, and it was a historic freedmen's town in Denton, Texas. It was established around the turn of the century, and what we're looking at here is an aerial photograph of the existing conditions of the park. The blue outline is sort of the extents of the park. It's a very large park. There's a series of various civic-oriented structures within the park. The current city hall is within the park. There's a library. There's a civic center. There's a senior center. There's a civic pool. There's a women's club building within the park. So there's a lot going on in there that are sometimes park-oriented features, sometimes not. The yellow dots and sort of the tan-colored lines there is a historic overlay of the original Quakertown. So this is an interesting study of, if those people had not been displaced from Quakertown, what would that potentially look like today within the context of this park? And you can see a lot of those roadways were removed, and there's buildings where previous buildings would have been. So it's just an interesting study of looking at sort of these layers of history. So Quakertown Park was, as we said, a freedmen's town. So it was an African-American neighborhood within Denton. Around 1920, when the Texas Women's University was built just north of Quakertown, there was some legislation passed, and eminent domain was utilized to basically evict all the landowners within Quakertown. It was then turned into a civic park almost immediately. So all of the homes and businesses were raised within the park, and it became city park, then it became civic park. So the descendants, the people that lived in Quakertown were then displaced to a community in southeast Denton. And today there's descendants of Quakertown that really want to address this history. In 2006, was it, Zach? The park was renamed Quakertown Park to honor that history, to acknowledge that history, and that sort of began the kickoff of how do we, move forward and talk about this history and incorporate it into the future of Quakertown Park. The sort of next layer of history within Quakertown Park is once that displacement occurred and it became civic park or city park, the various iterations of that. A famous architect that is from Denton, his name is O'Neill Ford. He was commissioned to design a series of buildings within the park and to do one of the original layouts of the park. The master plan that you're looking at here was actually done in the 90s, so it's a somewhat more recent one. The original O'Neill Ford plan was done, I believe, in the 50s or 60s. So there's a lot of structures. The Civic Center is the building that you see on top there, and then the public library is on the building there. It's had various additions done to it throughout time. But there's also the Senior Center and the City Hall. And because of the era that these buildings were constructed in and the how famous O'Neill Ford eventually became in the field of architecture, these buildings are now in the historic register. So they have a layer of protection to them within the context of this area that, these were built in an area where a community was displaced. So that's sort of the second layer of history that we're talking about here. So this is a very active and current process that we're going through. Next month, we're going to be hosting. Michelle talked about BioBlitz and bringing people out to the site to look at ecological systems and do that. We're hosting the Design Blitz, so we're going to be going to Denton, inviting city leaders, people within the city structure, and community members and descendants of Quakertown to actively charrette and design with us, to think about what does the future of Quakertown Park want to be. So this is one of the concepts that we are just kind of throwing out there just to start the conversation going. And this is sort of a hybrid of a bubble diagram and something with a little bit more detail to it, just to throw ideas out there, kind of see what sticks, what's resonating with the community, and what do they want to see there. So we're calling this concept Timelines of Denton. So the various parts of the park sort of address this very layered and complex history of Quakertown. So the bottom area that you see on that concept plan is the Quakertown Historic Zone, and that's sort of the entrance to the park. We're actually stretching the park over one of the main roads, McKinney Street, that runs sort of on the south side of the park there, and expanding that over to really invite people and pull people into the park. And there's a really intentional moment in gathering space there right at the head of the park at its main entrance, and thinking about what does memorial or memorialization look like in this park. We're, as part of that big design blitz that we're doing, we're going to be having a focus group conversation with descendants of people who were displaced from Quakertown. And that's going to be a core component of that conversation is what types of memorial do you all want to see here? What type of relationship do you want to have with the park? What's going to be appropriate for you and your community moving forward as we, come up with a vision for the future of this park? So continuing out of that memorial space, a history walk so that people can sort of learn more about this history, celebrate the history, be somber about the history. That's sort of what we're having this focus group meeting about, is the type of emotion that they want to see come out of this. The center part of this concept is the O'Neill Ford Historic Zone. So because these buildings are on the historic register, they're not going to go anywhere. So how do you kind of handle that history there, and how do you address that? This park is also very heavily utilized for festivals. There's a blues festival, there's an arts and jazz festival, there's random celebrations that pop up constantly. So it's also, how do you mix that heavily utilized sort of public, civic, urban context within this park? So making sure that we're creating enough space for this park to flux with, sometimes there's going to be thousands of people here, sometimes there's only going to be a handful. So having areas of open lawn, amphitheaters, getting more people utilizing this space with potentially introducing bike rentals into this park space. So that central area, that O'Neill Ford Historic Zone, acknowledging sort of the history of these buildings and the importance of that architect in the context of Denton's history, but also providing spaces for the celebrations and the festivals that happen today. And then the northern part of the park is really focused on thinking about what's the future of Quakertown Park. What's the relationship that people want to have with this park in the future? How is this park going to evolve in the future? So having it be really community oriented, expanding on the play area, really helping children create core memories in this park and establish a relationship with it. Community gardens, people can help nourish themselves and their family and their community within this park. Creating gathering areas or a community art walk that could potentially be rotational art, permanent installations. So really thinking about, the history of this park, how it's all layered, and how people can interact with these various histories in the park as it is today. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you. So we have about maybe 10-15 minutes for questions. If you have any question, if you raise your hand, I can bring the microphone so people on the other side of the Zoom can also hear us. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. This was amazing to watch. My name is Maria. I'm in the master's program for landscape architecture, almost done with our capstone. My question is directed to all of you, but I guess Zach mentioned it. When you said that you guys go over to the people, to the community, instead of bringing them to you, you mentioned that some of the people that you were able to talk to were homeless, but these are still part of the community. I want to know what were some of the insights that were helpful for that specific project that we might be able to use in the future to understand what we're missing out on from their perspective.
Thank you for that question. So I've actually had the opportunity to work in a couple of different contexts around issues of homelessness and unhoused populations. And I think one of the things that often comes up in those contexts is the conflict between housed community members and employees and business owners and the perceptions of space and the ways that people are using space. One of the things that we often hear, though, is that many of the concerns are shared between different parts of the community. Unhoused individuals are looking for safe spaces. That's why they're often in very public spaces, very visible spaces, because being unhoused can be very dangerous, and there's a lot of abuse that happens in those sorts of spaces. They're looking for opportunities for resources. They're looking for many of the same things. So one of the things that we try to talk a lot with our clients about is that one of the best ways to make spaces both feel and be safe is by attracting more activity to public spaces, and that's something that is actually mutually beneficial for communities that are unhoused and communities that are housed. And so that's a kind of key element. We find that a lot of the things that have historically been done to try to, I would just use the word discriminate against the unhoused populations, are often mutually unbeneficial. They actually create worse places that everybody doesn't want to be in. And so it often has this sort of spiraling effect in that. One of the other things, though, that we don't want to leave aside, and this is something we think about a lot, is that you can't just have spatial outcomes. You need to be thinking about the ways that programs and policies actually impact the spaces that you're in. So when we're doing work in downtown Denton, for example, we're also working with the local United Way and thinking about the ways that services can be provided better, and making sure that those opportunities are a component of what the community needs, as well as thinking about ways to resource other types of community-based programs that are going to really help with some of the challenges that we have around unhoused people in the U.S. today. Are there other things you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add one little insight to that as well, is the experience of people experiencing homelessness is also extremely contextual to the space they're in. And we've also had conflict where there's been people on steering committees that need to be enlightened more about the challenges. So another way we've gone about this is invited both care and partnership organizations to come talk to steering committee or clients. We did this in one project in Austin, and it was really helpful for the steering committee and the client to hear really what is going on in the community, and to think about it more holistically and kind of change patterns of thinking, which is another strategy.
And I will actually just add to that too. In contexts where we do have a steering committee, we work really hard to ensure that there's a level of representation that actually represents the community. So, we're doing a demographic analysis before we're actually selecting steering committee members, and we're setting goals around making sure that there's racial representation, that there's gender representation, that there's LGBTQ representation, generational representation within those. And in some contexts, we also have actually included individuals that have experienced homelessness or service providers on some of those steering committees to make sure that those sort of perspectives are represented. I'm just, real quick, one other, I was working in Salt Lake City, and we had a situation where we similarly had conflicts between a homeless shelter and the community surrounding it. And the first thing that we did as a part of that is we actually asked the service providers and homeless individuals to give us a tour of their neighborhood, talk to us about their issues. Then we did a tour with community members telling us about their issues, and we finally did a tour with police officers telling us about their issues. After doing that, we then brought them back together and let them know that all of them had pointed out the same problems. So instead of thinking about each other as being in conflict, they needed to actually start working together on the ways that, in that particular community, it was actually having to do with drug dealers taking advantage of the community and actually like hiding as unhoused individuals in order to, so there was this sort of perpetual preying on the community. But we were actually able to start thinking about what were some of the spatial things that we could do, design things that we could do that could actually disrupt that drug trade and pull some of that predation away from the community that had been happening. So we really started from a place where people had very little empathy for each other. We're able to work to build that and then actually begin to start thinking about spatial solutions to that.
And this will be quick. I don't think there's a big point to but I had a really interesting and really perspective-changing experience when I was in Denton doing an engagement event for Quakertown Park. It was during the Arts and Jazz Festival, which pulls thousands of people from Denton and the greater region. And a lot of the unhoused people in Denton find shelter within Quakertown Park. And we were doing engagement at a table under a tent in this big festival, and a woman walks into our tent area, and she tells us the story. She was an unhoused person, and she found her home in Quakertown Park, and she lived there for a handful of years, and she's no longer in that situation. She now has a roommate, and her living condition, it looks a lot different today, but she often revisits the park, and she has a really deep connection and a really deep relationship with that space. So as a designer looking at this space, talking with people who have that deep connection and will maintain that deep connection and continue visiting that park, even if it's not out of a living necessity, it's now, she had this really positive relationship with the park. It sustained her, it provided her shelter, and she wants to keep visiting it and visiting these spaces. That it was just a really interesting perspective to be provided as a designer of that space.
Thank you. I have one more hand from all the way back.
So thank you for coming. I'm Jenny. I'm also graduating in the Landscape Architecture Master's Program. So in the Rondo project, the land bridge, I know you touched on that. Do you mind just expanding more on the significance of it and the connection to, I think it was, you said, the African American Cultural District? And was that something that, I know, we mentioned the I-94 being the disruptor between that community. Was that something that came out through your design charrettes with the community? And yeah, how is that, connecting that community?
Thank you. So the idea of the land bridge, which will actually be it will be a structure over the highway that basically stretches from right about here until this bridge back here, is something that was entirely community generated before there were any consultants involved in any way. So it was an idea that had come out of the community as the MnDOT started to talk about the expansion of the highway. And part of the reason it actually came out is we have another version of this in another part of the Twin Cities. Our baseball stadium is on top of a highway. So it's a highway cap project that the stadium bridges over the highway. So this idea had kind of gotten into the public consciousness about being able to do something like this. The idea of the land bridge is that the rebuilding of this land in the middle and the return of its control to the African American community that had been displaced from it would actually create this opportunity to rebuild housing, to rebuild businesses, and so on. The piece that we were talking about, which was really in this anti-displacement and community investment component, was as this started to gain traction, it became clearer and clearer to the people who are organizing it that the act of actually rebuilding was going to change the economic opportunities or the economic dynamics in the entire surrounding community. And so they sort of began to understand that if we actually do this, we're actually creating new danger for people who are still in the community by doing it. So in advance of being able to move forward that plan, which right now, I think the goal is for construction probably somewhere around 2035. It's 15 years in the future, or I guess it's 2024, so it's 11 years in the future. But that they needed to actually start investing in the economic development of the community and the stabilization of housing in the community now. So the project that we did was actually well in advance of actually the full design. So there's sort of, right now, we did the anti-displacement component. Now they're doing a neighborhood plan that's thinking about the investment in everywhere around it. And then the next step in that will actually be hiring a landscape architecture team that will actually design the actual structure and the component of the bridge based on all of that. One of the other things that's been really cool in this, though, I would say, is that it is an African-American run organization. They've actually received the federal grants directly, so rather than MnDOT being the one who gets the $100 million, they've gotten it and they're running all of the process. And out of the 5 African-American engineering firms in Minnesota, 4 of them are working on this project right now. And I think the long-term goal is that also once they actually move towards selection of a landscape architect, they've made a pretty firm commitment that they want it to be an African-American-led team on the landscape architecture as well, which is really, really, I think, exciting for St. Paul, Minnesota, and the project. I can run it over, so you don't have to run up the stairs.
Thank you again for coming. My name is Milena. I'm one of the architecture students. Have yet quite a while to graduate. But what I really appreciate about you guys, obviously it's in the name, it's collaborative. And while you and your team may speak to a lot of people and have a lot of different sorts of experiences with those different types of people, and so be comfortable in that change, obviously not everyone does. And I kind of wanted to ask how, you guys kind of already got into it a little bit, but how do you then manage to bring that quality of your team into other stakeholders like cities or anyone?
So I think I'm just going to sort of dovetail on what I talked about with the Falwell Park project, with building that project team, trying to intentionally bring those values to how we're structuring our team and who's actually contributing to the built environment and whose voices are being heard from that perspective. But we often, Zach talked a lot about, we try and set goals at the outset of projects with our client teams. And we really try to, we're in a pretty lucky situation where we don't shy away from who we are. So when a client decides to hire us, most of our clients are municipal organizations, cities, counties, nonprofits. They understand who they're working with, and that we really intentionally like to not only build teams, but bring in community partners into the process whose voices aren't represented either on this panel here or through whoever we bring on as subconsultants on the project. So even though, we really enjoy doing community engagement, it's something that we really value. If we know that we haven't won this project yet, we're hoping. We just turned in a proposal for, it's 3 park design. It's a project for 3 park designs in an area of North St. Paul, so in the Twin Cities, and it's the community has a very large and growing Hmong population. We don't have anyone that's Hmong on our project team. Our team, in men's team. So what we intentionally tried to do was bring in that community representation as sort of a bridge to to a community that is really hard to reach in traditional engagement ways. So Zach had a great connection. She is an artist. She's trained in architecture, urban design. She is a community connector. And we asked her to be very generous and join our project team and sort of be that community engagement liaison. So if we know that, we on this panel aren't representing the community, we really work with either the client or through our project building process to bring people on that are representative of that community and, people that community will feel comfortable talking to and coming out for and really understand.
I was just going to say, this may put like a little bit too fine a point on it, but early in my career, I was working for a client, and they came to me sort of midway through a project and said, "We really love the advocacy you do, but we wish you could be more of just a planner." And I just absolutely reject that differentiation. I think that when people say that, what they mean is, we wish you could be a little more upper middle class, white, male, straight people, and in the way that you're bringing your project approach, and that we don't really see that differentiation, that we are advocates for our community, but we see that as being a part of being good designers, and that our experience, our lived experience and the community's lived experience are an important part of what makes design that is not a top-down thing that can really work with communities.
Yeah, and I have just a few other quick things. You guys did that really well. I would say another thing we think about is language and language justice. So oftentimes we try to work with firms that really specialize in that. We try not to just have somebody, whether they be in the client team or somebody that's not actually trained in the justice side of it, to just do the translations. So it's something we actively seek out as part of our process. And I had something else to add, but I can't remember. So, do you have anything? I know, I'll probably remember.
Our emails are up here and also the website too.
So you have a hard question from a former classmate.
Dzień dobry. Hi, thanks for a beautiful presentation. My question, and my experience, some of the resistance, as you're alluding to, working with people who are genuinely committed to participation, is the kind of how to navigate and how to juggle all of the data that comes in that is not easy to put into bullet points, right, and kind of streamline and automate. So I wonder if you could peel back that curtain for us a little and say, what do you do, and how does the information that you gather from all of these activities translate into a design outcome? So I know that's time-wise and just strategically, how do you juggle all of that?
Yeah. Well, I thank you for that question. It's different for every project, right? Like if it's actually a project we're designing, we have our strategies for doing that. But if I speak to the All Abilities Playground, that one will be a build project, and the next phase for the city is to put out a contract to do the design for it. And that one did have quantitative and qualitative. And I first want to say that we're still working on those processes. I came out of that project going, oh, we need some sort of strategy. I mean, even some sort of like standardized spreadsheet to do this really well. And to also start to use different practices kind of more academically in the sense of how do you take quantitative data qualitative data in a more scientific way. You know, there's been great work out on that, and although we can't always do an academic process for what we're doing, we like to take and learn from that. And so for All Abilities, what it came down to for us is making sure the recommendations are incredibly clear. The idea is that this final document will be what hopefully the designer will take and be able to see when they talked about physical play, the community wanted this, this, and this, and that also includes the kids' play shop. They wanted this and this, and there's overlap there. So I think it's knowing the audience of who it's going to be for, and making that really digestible. And we may not be the final designers for this, so it needs to work and be able to guide that process moving forward. I know it's not like a perfect explanation, but I think we're learning as we're going, in the sense, in some ways there's some things we do very automatically, like online surveys. We know that, and so pushing us into exploring different things like the play shop, where we're using observation, is a place we've been kind of delving into more.
There's client pushback on you're gonna watch kids play?
Yeah, they actually wanted us to have more of, like a number-based way of figuring this out. But I think all of us as a group decided, if we're up there in the kids' face talking to them every single second, it'll be awkward. It'll make the parents feel maybe uncomfortable, and the kids aren't going to actually play. They're going to be talking to an adult, and that's just not going to work. So I think it was a good strategy to use. I think in the future, we always learn from our processes. We did have some challenges where things maybe got a little too rowdy, so how to pull things back. Maybe actually having a few interviews with parents and kids would have been a good way to also do that as well. So, yeah.
And I can talk to another kind of way of taking qualitative information and kind of translating it into recommendations. So less data focused, but more like another perspective of approaching community engagement is through the storytelling. We didn't talk about this project. It was one that I've worked with a couple of years ago, but it was kind of a trail and kind of placemaking along a creek in South Austin, and it was very community focused. We engaged a lot, specifically with the neighborhood, with people whose houses backed up to the creek, and we asked people to create these creek journals where they would go to the creek and kind of reflect on their relationship with it. There was some tough history there because it flooded a lot, and actually the Army Corps of Engineers had to do some buyouts of homes to remove them and demolish the structures. So that was kind of another layer of history of what this community and neighborhood has been through. But we asked people to reflect on their experience with the creek and kind of their relationship with it. A lot of people used it, even though there wasn't a formalized trail there, they used it for recreation to kind of walk up and down and spend time in nature. We asked people to document their experiences there and their values of why that was a great place to be. And we heard a lot of stories about wanting to bringing their children there, having it be a gathering space, kind of to have a picnic or things like that. And we can kind of translate a lot of those stories into recommendations, even though they might not be saying I would like a bench, or I would like a, XYZ. You can say, okay, where they're telling me that they're valuing spending time with friends and family in this space. So I can make the logical translation that a gathering space or a picnic table or a bench here or providing some access to the creek would be what they would want. So kind of asking people to tell stories and then translating from there.
And the last question going to come from one of our professors who nominated you to come to Miami to give us this lecture.
Okay, first of all, thank you. It's just a really inspiring and motivating lecture. And you partly already answered my question because I was going to ask, it's clear that you clearly lead from your values, and you mentioned that that's part of, it's kind of embedded into the clientele and why you're being sought out by potential clients, so that was part of it. And the other part that I was so struck by in the early part, you mentioned, all the different ways that your work is reparative, and one way is internally. So I was wondering if you could speak a little more about that, just because it's such a big issue, and it's clearly something that you all have been very intentional about, and it's kind of coming through in your work. So thank you, and for also talking the talk, not just walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
I think internally, when we think about the organization of our company and kind of how we like to interface with staff and with each other, we've talked a lot about kind of like flattening traditional systems of hierarchy in firms and kind of allowing everyone to have voice, especially in decisions that are being made. So we recently we're about to kind of put offers out to summer interns, and we had our staff sit in on rounds of interviews. Every person was really involved in some step of the interview process. And we just had a call with everybody saying, hey, who did everybody like? We did a round table of like, who would your picks be, et cetera. Someone who is just kind of has just been with us a little under a year right out of school is going to be supervising an intern over the summer. So really trying to introduce people early to become decision makers and to know that they're valued in their opinions, and we want to hear from them, and they are leaders, and they can guide people who are also just coming into the firm is a way that we think about kind of flattening hierarchical systems.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. We try to work as hard as a team together, and there are times where we know that maybe a staff member is right at capacity. So I think all of us have reached out and said, how can I have an hour of time, how can I pick up from what you're doing? So we try to create redundancies in our teams to be able to do that and to know at least a little bit of the process of each of us so we can jump in and support where it's needed. And I've been really excited to know our longest staff member is Kennedy, who you saw. I announced her first, and she's been with us for almost a year now. And the longest week she's ever had was 42 hours. And I think that's just glorious. Like, let's keep that up, make sure people have live life and work balances that they can, keep going. It's really important. We're also internally, and Sandy, I'll pass this to you next because Sandy's been working on a lot of our HR processes. So we're also trying to find out how to capture just general feel. How are you feeling at work? And so creating some sort of survey to capture that.
Yeah, I think before I get into that, I mean, we touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but I think all of us come from backgrounds of being undervalued at work, working conditions where we just kind of felt like a cog and a little taken advantage of. And so when we started this company, we really wanted to intentionally address that and be really transparent about all of our own personal experiences and how we want to remove that from our way of doing things. So we don't want to see employees leave because it was a working condition where they felt taken advantage of or abused in any way. We also internally sort of make promises to each other. We really intentionally, so as part of all of us coming to Miami here, we extended our trip by a day to have a partners retreat because we're all in person. There's something that's so much more valuable about being in person, seeing each other face to face, reestablishing our values with each other, talking about what our goals are moving forward, what has been working, what hasn't been working. We do that with our staff too. We do a yearly retreat with our staff where we do goal setting and talk about the state of the firm and what's working for them, what's not working, how we need to change. So we try and just really from like a top level address all of that with everybody and kind of reiterate it with ourselves a lot. But yeah, I come from 10 years in the service industry where I worked in restaurants and I always ended up finding myself on the management side of stuff. So I kind of by default took on the HR, putting our employee handbook, which we call our field guide together. But there's some boilerplate stuff in that you kind of legally have to have in those handbooks and blah, blah, blah. But some of the stuff that we knew we could really have a hand in crafting, like our policy regarding a new child entering the family, being able to involve our staff members, both a birthing parent, a non-birthing parent, and what does that policy look like for them. And going through that process, talking to our staff members, we ended up with like a menu of options because that's not necessarily a one size fits all for everybody. So we had really open conversations about that, and that was a really good outcome. And then we meet on water coolers pretty much every morning with all of our staff, and we try and do check-ins then, but that's not always the most comfortable way to say, hey, I'm struggling, I'm not feeling great, is in front of like everyone in your colleagues. So we've been talking about doing something, putting in our handbook, maybe like a survey or something, a more subtle way where you can sort of like do a pain chart of, I'm on a 0 to 10, I'm feeling a 7, it's a really hard week. Or maybe I'm at a 2, things are going great, I'm really comfortable. So just finding ways where our staff can communicate to us in ways that feel the most comfortable to them.
And there are just like little ways to make this actionable too. Like we really do, we work 40 hours a week. Very seldom do we spend a lot of time over that. There's, of course, you're in consulting and there's little times that you do have to do that, but that is our standard, and we work to set barriers with our clients to make sure that happens as well. And then just like little things like, we typically, if I need to send an email after 6 o'clock, I will schedule it for the next day. We don't send emails on weekends. Like we have these sorts of things where it's expected that when you check out, you've checked out, and we'll see you on Monday at 9, not again. So you can actually build these things as like little policies in the ways that you're interacting, because your employees they'll replicate the way that you're doing things. And so we want to be intentional about the ways that we're thinking about how we just do like those little things that actually make a difference in the way that people feel the expectations that you have set on them and with them.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and great lecture. We will not let you go. So as we discuss, we are going to be taking each of you to one of our landscape architecture design studios, and you will be giving feedback to our students for the rest of the afternoon, and we will connect one of you to Manor Winwood campus through Zoom so that they can also benefit from your expertise and knowledge. So before we let all of you to leave, I have one quick announcement. We are joined by 11 Turkish professors and professionals. They are sitting right here. If you could please stand up and recognize. They are doing their annual visit. They are coming from Cuba. They had a little trip there, and they will be also joining to your studios. They will be providing feedback. Thank you for taking the time to join our lecture today, and let's give a big round of applause to our MEN collaborative. And lastly, I shared in social media and sent some emails, but please keep in mind that IFLA, International Federation of Landscape Architects, annual design competition is open. I'm serving on the competition committee, and I'm also going to be sitting as a juror. So please rethink, repackage, submit your projects either from this semester or from former semesters to this competition. And the deadline is not until the end of your school term. Look at the details. All of your projects are eligible, so please take a look at categories and submit your projects. The IFLA, next IFLA is going to be in Istanbul. Maybe it brings you an opportunity to go visit and receive your award there. Thank you guys. Have a good afternoon.